Chapter 1 Background. Before Atlantic City was what it is today, it was arguably one of the nicest and most visited vacation cities on the entire East Coast. Home to various premier hotels, the first boardwalk, and dozens of other attractions, the seaside resort was subject to almost a constant influx of vacationers from northeastern cities such as Washington, Baltimore, Philadelphia, and New York, desiring to spend time at the beach. The main way into the city was via the Atlantic City Road and the Camden Atlantic Railroad, which ran parallel, owned by the Pennsylvania Railroad and Reading Railroads, respectively. These two would merge in the 1930s to form Pennsylvania-Reading Seashore Lines, but before this, competition between the two was notoriously aggressive, with the lines to Atlantic City being dubbed the racetrack due to the breakneck speeds that the trains achieved. The majority of these trains, however, originated in Philadelphia, requiring New Yorkers to travel to Philadelphia first via either the Pennsylvania over what is now the Northeast Corridor, or the C&J in Reading to Bound Brook, or Allentown, where they would board a Reading train to Philadelphia, then transfer again to a train bound for Atlantic City. The C&J, which shared its main line between New York and Bound Brook with its parent company, the Reading, possessed a line southward connected with the Camden Atlantic Railroad at Winslow Junction. Prior to the introduction of the Blue Comet, the C&J had operated several trains in conjunction with the Pennsylvania, which were some of the only passenger trains they ran that netted an actual profit, which eventually began to fall behind the services offered by the Pennsylvania and the Reading. The C&J, in a desperate attempt to recoup some of the lost profits, introduced a train that would offer deluxe service for a regular fare. Most of the other trains to Atlantic City indeed offered deluxe service, but came with a higher price tag to match. The C&J's lower price was intended to gain the upper hand over the Pennsylvania's Nellie Bly, a direct competitor to the Comet, which was known as a train for the elite. The C&J's Southern Division, formerly the New Jersey Southern Railroad, and before that the Raritan and Delaware Bay Railroad, traveled southwest from Red Bank to the coast of the Delaware Bay. This was nowhere close to Atlantic City, but passed over the Reading and Pennsylvania's lines from Philadelphia, essentially the railroad equivalent to today's Atlantic City Expressway, which later merged to form the Pennsylvania-Reading Seashore Lines, also known as the PRSL, at a place called Winslow Junction. The rough idea of the service that the Blue Comet would provide before it was introduced had been filled by such trains as the Atlantic City Express, which had done essentially the same thing but for a higher fare using normal and cars leased from Pullman. Upon the Blue Comet's introduction, the sheer amount of fanfare it caused was monumental, and without the onset of the Great Depression, which prohibited most people from taking a summer vacation to Atlantic City, even with the bargain fares the Comet offered, might have allowed the service to continue well past 1941, as the peak of its service was during the summer of 1929, which was unfortunately very early in its career, when the trains were recorded to have multiple entirely full runs multiple times per week. The formation of PRSL would contribute to the eventual downfall of the Comet, as the Pennsylvania used their partial ownership to give their trains favorable time slots that had once been occupied by the Comet. Chapter 2 The Route. The Blue Comet departed Track 10 of the C&J's Communipaw Terminal and ran west from there to Elizabethport, where it was diverted onto the New York and Long Branch, where it led to Red Bank. At Red Bank, it was diverted southwest onto the Southern Division, the former track to the NJS and R&DB railroads. It traveled down to Winslow Junction, where it traveled over the PRSL to Atlantic City. Sadly, little of the route survives today, as all trackage north of the NY and LB was either removed or abandoned under Conrail or NJ Transit, or to the C&J's Aldine plan. The NY and LB is now operated by NJ Transit, along with most of the former Pennsy-Reading Seashore lines, but these are no longer connected by the NJS, as large portions of it have been abandoned. Chapter 3 The Locomotives. The G3s that are normally associated with the Blue Comet were built by Baldwin in 1928, a little more than a year before the train entered service. It was thought the introduction of the Comet was anticipated, causing the order of larger express passenger locomotives. The G3s were the penultimate class of C&J Pacifics, and their steam fleet itself, being followed by the G4s, which are essentially the same locomotive, but with smaller driving wheels to fit through Lansford Tunnel in Pennsylvania. The G3s were built with the standard root and firebox and wagon top boiler, but were unique visually for the presence of the Nalesco feedwater heater in front of the upper part of the smoke box. A nameplate was hung underneath this, which could be flipped around if the locomotive was used on other trains instead of the Comet. Upon delivery from Baldwin in 1928, all members of the class were painted a shade of green similar to that of the C&J's passenger cars. G3 number 834 remained in the scheme for service on the Blue Comet sister train, the Bullet, which ran between Communipaw and Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania. 835, the only other member of the class, was repainted in the early 1930s black for general service, although it primarily hauled trains such as the Interstate Limited or the Queen of the Valley. The remaining G3s, 831, 832, and 833, were painted blue with gold striping to match their cars and were given unique steamboat-type whistles. With the end of the Comet, the steamboat whistles were removed, and it appears one may have ended up on a small B-class Camel on the Pennsylvania division, which survived in the 1950s. Although there are likely no original recordings of these left, several witnesses have described the steamboat whistles as sounding similar to a pipe organ or like a Reading 6 chime, but taller, sounding an octave lower. Based on photos, they were long bell flat top 3 chimes, and it is unknown whether they were shop fabricated or one of the commercially available types of whistles by Hancock or Star Brass. The C&J did operate a fleet of actual steamboats and steam ferries and steam-powered tugboats, but it is very unlikely that one of these whistles was used on the Comet, as these were far larger. As the Comet ran during the Depression, a time when few people were considering summer trips to Atlantic City, the locomotives were often assigned heavier services on the main line into Pennsylvania and the NY&LB. During these absences, the Comet was usually hauled by a G1 or G2 Pacific, or in multiple cases, a P6 class Atlantic. The preserved 592, a P6, is known to have hauled the Comet at least a few times. Chapter 3.5 The Rolling Stock. The train was made up of newly constructed C&J Standard Express passenger cars built by the Bethlehem Shipbuilding Company. The cars had their interiors reconfigured, trading the commuter-style bench seats for 64 reclining bucket seats and enlarged restroom lounges. The observation cars were equipped with swiveling wicker chairs and 6 folding chairs on the observation deck. The diner, Giacobini, however, dated to 1901, was constructed of wood, which had been plated over with steel, and its small arch windows above the main windows were quite noticeably blanked over in much the same manner as the rest of the car, albeit not on the inside. The Giacobini was unique as it was the only true heavyweight passenger car, aside from the baggage cars, on the train, as it had 3-axle trucks. All cars were named after an orbiting comet and were painted a shade of blue, extremely close to Packard blue, with a band of cream with gold lining running laterally over the windows. This scheme was said to represent the sea, sand, and sky of the Jersey Shore. The roofs and undersides of the car were painted a darker blue. Chapter 3.6 The Whitney Railway Museum's Jersey Coast. The Jersey Coast, an observation car of the same class as those used on the Blue Comet, was preserved after exiting service under NJT by the Whitney Railway Museum. It has since been painted into the Blue Comet scheme and fitted with a Blue Comet drumhead. This is the closest one can really get to riding an authentic Blue Comet car in service with any regularity. Chapter 3.7 Connecting Buses. With the introduction of the Comet, the C&J took the opportunity to eliminate most of the passenger service on the lines south of Winslow Junction, which were found to be highly unprofitable for pretty much anything but freight. They replaced this service with a bus service using the buses formerly assigned to the Jolly Tar Trail, which was the train replacement service between Lakewood and Toms River stations on the Toms River and Barnegat branches. This service was operated by the company's 2 plush 27-seat buses, American Car and Foundry Model 508-2-3Bs, with the B denoting the fact that it was a bus instead of a rail car, which the American Car and Foundry usually made, with Blue Comet-style emblems emblazoned on the sides. The drivers on these buses were clad in New Jersey State Police-style uniforms with leather belts and suspenders. Chapter 4 Promotional Stuff. The Blue Comet, as a concept, was created to ferry passengers across the state from Communipaw Terminal to Atlantic City via Winslow Junction in deluxe style at a normal coach fare, about 8:40 at the start. Christened into service on February 21st of 1929, the Blue Comet was the brainchild of the CNJ's president at the time, Roy B. White. According to fellow officers, White kept plans of the train under extreme secrecy, taking control of the project to the point of single-handedly choosing what cars were assigned to the train and designing the features of the train's service. The train was the subject of an extremely well-executed advertising campaign, creating elaborate posters and flyers detailing the deluxe service of the train for its average price, taking promotional images, and even distributing invitational flyers to commuters to examine the train before its service debut when it was parked up in Communipaw Terminal. In celebration of the train, a multitude of employees from the Ashley, Pennsylvania shops formed the Blue Comet Band, even though Ashley was, strangely enough, nowhere close to the route of the train. The band would perform promotional events, not just ones related to the Blue Comet, held throughout the entire system. Specially branded timetables, tickets, and baggage checks printed on blue stock were issued. The train was primarily staffed by the senior employees of the CNJ, as they did not desire risking the possibility of any amateurs making even the slightest possible mistakes, as this was the premier train of the company. Specially branded timetables, tickets, and baggage checks, which were printed on blue stock, were issued. The porters were dressed in special blue uniforms, the dining car staff wore white uniforms and shoes with blue vests and accents, and noted CNJ conductor Joseph Ross, a former conductor of the multiple Atlantic City Expresses, dyed his trademark lapel carnations blue to match the train. Ross was a regular crew member until his retirement in 1933 after 55 years of service. This became a pride point to the company, as it is recorded that the engineer, John Waite, 53 years of service, and head conductor, Joseph Ross, 51 years of service, on the first run had a combined seniority of over a century, about half a decade longer than the CNJ itself had existed. The marketing campaign didn't end with the debut, however. Annually, the CNJ would host a party aboard, celebrating the anniversary of the train's inauguration, even serving a themed birthday cake. For the 5th anniversary of the train in 1934, locomotive number 833 was fitted with 5 comically large, about 4 foot tall, electric candles on its pilot. Several collaborations took place between the rail-bound Comet and various famous aviators. The crew of the German airship Graf Zeppelin rode the train to and from the Lakehurst Naval Air Base, where the airship was docked and stored, and New York, where they stayed when not in the air. Famous British aviator Jessie Maud Miller, who had set a record flying from London to Australia, was offered by the C&J the chance to race the train from Lakehurst to Atlantic City. Miller was given a training craft from the Lakehurst fleet, and when she inevitably lost, was given a cab ride back to Lakehurst. An interesting footnote in the history of the Comet was the relationship between the train's crew and the residents of Lakewood and some small towns in the Jersey Pines. It was recorded that the train crew would often throw a few newspapers, paid for with their own salary, off at the station where residents would pass them a couple cartons of blueberries or cranberries or other local produce, which were cultivated in the area, or even the rare bottle of wine. These would either be served in any of the variety of a la carte meals in the dining car, or split among the crew and taken home. Chapter 4.5 That One Sign. The original sign this was replicated from was stationed on the Route 34 bridge over the Southern Division at Collingwood Park. It is noted to have incorrectly read the train passed at 12:17 a.m., which should have read p.m. This mistake was somehow not caught before it was placed on the line. This replica is at the Whippany Rail Museum in Whippany, NJ, also home of the Jersey Coast. Chapter 4.6 The Tuckerton Excursion. On Sunday, April 16th of 1939, the National Railroad Historical Society, North Jersey chapter, sponsored a full-day excursion over about 380 miles of the C&J, Southern Division, Tuckerton, and Cumberland Maurice River Railroads, using both regular C&J and Blue Comet equipment. C&J L6460C, number 758, hauled the train from Communipaw to Barnegat on the Toms River branch, where the train was handed off to Tuckerton Railroad / Southern NJ Railroad, 440s numbered 5 and 6. This is the only known incident of the Comet cars being hauled by a 440. The train traveled over the Tuckerton Railroad to Tuckerton and back, where the train was handed back to 758. The train consisted of the cars Temple, Holmes, Westfall, Dearest, Brorson, and standard C&J Diner 1183, along with standard C&J Coach 1197. Chapter 5. Accidents. Throughout the Blue Comet's operation, several accidents had occurred involving multiple vehicle collisions. On Friday, January 10th of 1936, a produce truck driven by farmhand William Taylor, age 42, was struck by the Blue Comet while crossing the tracks at Finkel's Crossing in Shrewsbury. Taylor, employed by C. Borderson of Shrewsbury, was crossing the farm transporting produce when his truck stalled on the crossing. The crossing, being on a privately owned road on private land, was deemed unnecessary for a watchman or gates. Taylor was killed instantly, and the locomotive was severely damaged as a valve cap on the automatic safety control system, which was mounted on the pilot, was almost entirely destroyed and was severely leaking steam. The train remained at the site for about an hour until limping into Eatontown, where the locomotive was replaced with an extra locomotive stored at Red Bank. The engineer, William J. Smith, was taken into custody by the police for questioning and stated that the bell had been ringing since the train departed Red Bank, and the whistle had been properly sounded. He was later released. At 6:10 p.m. on Monday, September 8th of 1941, Antoinette McCocha and two of her children, Gloria, age 13, and Joanne, age 4, died upon collision with the Blue Comet in a light delivery truck near their home at White Horse Pike Elm on an unprotected crossing, which only had a sign. The accident occurred as McCocha was driving home after visiting a neighbor seeking advice on canning vegetables. Only a few minutes after departing Hamilton, A. Fierling, the engineer, jammed on the emergency brake, but the train collided with the van and came to a stop several hundred yards up the line. The police, having been notified, delayed the train for about an hour. Collisions between the C&J's Blue Comet and the Pennsylvania's Sea Breeze at Farmingdale, NJ. Collisions between the Blue Comet and the Pennsylvania's Sea Breeze at Farmingdale were narrowly avoided multiple times, as the two train schedules were separated only by minutes, as the Comet had to run through the diamond that the Sea Breeze was often stopped on to board passengers. Chapter 6. Chatsworth. The worst accident to ever befall the Blue Comet occurred on the rainy evening of August 19, 1939. Southern New Jersey was struck by an extremely intense low-pressure system, causing an estimated 13.5 inches of rain, which was measured by the Chatsworth Cranberry Association, with about 10 1/4 inches of that falling between 2 to 6 p.m. A few miles south of Chatsworth Station, a washout had occurred, critically damaging about 30 feet of track. Northbound Blue Comet, train number 4218, had received a message at Winslow Junction, 19.7 miles to the south, telling them to run at a reduced speed of 35 miles per hour instead of the usual 70 miles per hour, and to look for sand filling in the flange gaps in the road crossings. Obeying these orders, the train ran north to Atchon, and then set off to Chatsworth. Still traveling under 35 miles per hour, the train passed over the washout. Seeing this, Engineer Thomas rapidly applied the brake, but the momentum carried the train over. The locomotive, G2 number 820, and its tender managed to clear the washout and remain on the rails, while the rest of the train derailed. The 5 cars, Haley, DRS, Winneck, Giacobini, and Biella, came to rest on their sides, injuring 32 out of the 49 riders, including the crew. None were fatal, except for the case of the train's chef, Joseph Coleman, who later passed away from injuries sustained from various objects, such as knives being thrown around in the kitchen. Most of the injuries sustained by passengers were due to the unsecured wicker chairs in the observation car, Biella. I.L. Gordon of the C&J's PR department noted that if the wreck had been the next day, a Sunday, there may have been several hundred passengers aboard instead of 49. The diner, Giacobini, had sustained irreparable amounts of damage due to its steel over wood construction, and was removed from its trucks and used as a yard office near Communipaw Ave in Jersey City. Compensating for its loss, the C&J traded the use of the observation Biella to the Reading in return for use of a diner, already being used in Reading C&J pool service. Under the Reading, the Biella was never renumbered or relettered, and could be found in use on trains from Philadelphia to Communipaw, and often was employed in excursion service on weekends by both railroads. Chapter 7. The Decline and Aftermath. From the start of its operation, the Blue Comet faced competitions from not only other railroads, but from buses, not to mention the Great Depression, with the Lincoln Transit Company operating a bus between New York City and Atlantic City for a $3.75 round-trip fare, less than half of that of the Comet at the time. With the formation of Pennsylvania Red and Seashore Lines in 1933, the Pennsylvania assumed control of its route and began to schedule their own trains favorably compared to the Comet, and began to discriminate against it in station advertising. In August of 1934, both the CNJ and PRR lowered their fares, which caused ridership of the Comet to rebound, but only briefly as the ridership continued to shrink. The fare was lowered again in 1936 to $6.10 for a round trip, which caused ridership to grow steadily between the prior decrease in 1938, but operating revenue was only $61,315, less than a quarter of the total revenue in 1931. The connecting bus to Bridgeton was terminated in 1936, and in November of 1938, several of the Blue Comet's cars were painted green during routine repairs, but they retained their interiors. After the wreck at Chatsworth, the decline in service became more noticeable than ever. The decline really was present from the start, as within the year of its debut, the stock market crashed, causing an almost immediate decline in ridership, causing the reduction of consist sizes. The major hits to service began in 1936, with the removal of the diner service on some of the runs, and the occasional substitution of one of the specially painted G3s with the smaller Pacifics and a variety of Camelbacks, including the remaining Atlantics. The G3s were often needed for the longer and heavier trains on the main line into Pennsylvania, and it wasn't uncommon to see one of the Blue Pacifics, even with their name boards, pulling a large passenger train up through the Lehigh River Valley. In October of 1939, the CNJ petitioned the Public Utility Commission, or PUC, to terminate service. The train's ridership had decreased from 20,703 riders in 1938 to 13,668 in 1939, and the operating deficit had ballooned from $28,700 to $48,200 respectively. The PUC denied the request as the CNJ had not made every reasonable effort to meet the public's convenience, and suggested the CNJ decrease the fare from 2.5 cents per mile down to 2 to complete with the Pennsylvania. The PUC also suggested the establishment of a connecting bus service between Communipod Terminal and Manhattan. Hearing the CNJ's plans for cancellation, the PRR investigated purchasing the train's cars from the CNJ and assigning them to Nellie Bly, but this was never carried out. The CNJ, now determined to rid themselves of this unique but financially unsustainable train, filed again with the PUC on June 21st of 1941. The operating revenue had sunk once again from $74,900 in 1939 to $66,900 in 1940, despite a $6,000 advertising campaign and a lowered fare of 1.5 cents per mile. The passenger count had slightly increased to 14,045, which evened out to roughly 16 passengers per train, which is not good, and the total operating loss for 1940 being $59,991. The PUC finally decided to allow the cancellation under the condition that the lake would still be served at the same rate that it had during the years the Blue Comet served it. During its 12 years of operation, the Blue Comet carried 1,680,168 passengers to Atlantic City and back, and ran a total of 367,248 miles. The final run of the Comet was on September 27th of 1941. Hauled by G3 number 831, which had now been repainted into black, the train carried 171 passengers on the southbound 4203 and 173 on the northbound 4218, with 157 of them being members of the Railroad Enthusiast Club. These members received commemorative menus and tickets. The entire fleet of G3s were scrapped around 1954, but most of the cars continued past 1976 into Conrail. In the late 1960s, Observation Temple and RPO number 74 were used as a makeshift station and waiting room at Point Pleasant, whilst the old station was being demolished and replaced. Temple had been used as a portable office before, over the Central, New York, Long Branch, and Southern subdivisions. Observation car DeVico was the last observation car on any revenue train in the U.S., and was later converted to NJ Transit Executive Car Number 1. Chapter 8. Preservation. The Blue Comet as a train has a stellar preservation record when compared to most other named trains of its day, as there are a total of 6 cars, with parts of 2 preserved out of 16 cars in total. Looking back at Chapter 3.6, the Whitney Railway Museum painted the observation car, the Jersey Coast, into the Blue Comet scheme, giving us a preservation rate of 133.3%, as all original observation cars survive, along with a repainted car of the same class. Sadly, none of the G3 survived, but P6 Atlantic number 592 is preserved in the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad Museum in Baltimore, Maryland. With this locomotive, it would be possible to create a historically accurate run of the Comet, but alas, 592 is gutted and would require a fortune to return to steam. Following is a roster of the preserved Blue Comet cars. Haley, number 300, is heavily modified in Arizona and used by the Santa Fe Southern. The baggage windows were blanked out and the vestibules removed, turning it into something that looks like a car, maybe about 30 years older than it actually is. Temple, observation car 1169, is preserved at the Cape May Seashore Lines in Tuckahoe, New Jersey by the Tri-State RHS. Westfall is preserved by the URHS in Boonton and is undergoing a restoration. It was formerly stored at Winslow Junction. Passenger car due arrest and observation to Vico, number 1173 and 1178 respectively, are also preserved by the URHS in Boonton and were located at Winslow Junction. The observation car Biella, number 1179, is now somewhat preserved, but also kind of used as an actual diner on 287. Diner Giacobini and coach Winnick had parts salvaged by Tom Gallo and Frank Riley, amongst others, and parts of it can be found on C&J coach number 1009 at the Black River and Western. This has been a brief history of the Blue Comet, and I thank you for watching.